It's Friday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Keir Starmer launches his campaign in Scotland.
This is an election about change. And Scotland's voice is vital, absolutely vital.
Rishi Sunak's been in Northern Ireland this morning.
What the country needs is leadership that can provide bold action and that has a clear plan, because that's how we will deliver a secure future for everyone in our country.
Also today, energy bills are coming down. So is the cost of living crisis almost over?
There is a very stark difference now between us and the Labour Party on this issue, because my focus is cheap energy.
Jeremy Corbyn confirms he will run as an independent candidate. How much of a headache is that for Labour?
It's so good to be here in Eastbourne.
And what impact will the Liberal Democrats have on this election? Joining us today, Conservative MP and Northern Ireland Minister Steve Baker, Labour MP and Shadow Business Minister Sarah Jones, Spectator political editor Katie Balls and Associate Political Editor of The New Statesman Rachel Cunliffe. This is Politics Live Election 2024. Let's start with this BBC News headline: energy bills to fall again from July under new cap. Yes, the news that energy bills are set to fall by an average of £122 a year. That means that a household using the typical amount of gas and electricity will pay just over £1,500 a year. Reaction?
It's good news. It's part of our overall plan to make sure that we have affordable energy for families. So that's why the energy price guarantee will be in there, and it's why we're going for oil and gas. It's why we're making sure that the cost of net zero is contained and that families have affordable energy.
Sarah?
Well, it's good news it's coming down, but it's still £400 higher than it was before the Ukraine war started. So for the Tories to announce that as some kind of victory and we're all, better off than we were before is nonsense. They have no plans to fix it. Labour's plan is for homegrown energy, the only way that will bring down bills. There were a series of announcements today by Claire Coutinho. They were all, in fact, consultations and asking for evidence. None of them were definitive policies. We have a fully costed plan, definitive policies for bringing down bills, making our country more secure. That's why we need change.
You're laughing.
Only because of the idea that we haven't got a plan is ridiculous.
What is your plan that you announced today? If
you look, for example, at putting through oil and gas licences, we know we need oil and gas, even if you go...
We agree.
Well, didn't you vote against it?
We'll need oil and gas for years, and we won't revoke the licences that are already there. We have a plan for what is going to happen over the long term, which is oil and gas licences. Oil and gas will
it's very interesting to me
because we need green energy, homegrown energy.
It's very interesting as somebody who had to run a quite high-cost politically campaign on the cost of net zero. I'm quite pleased that we've now achieved where we are, that we're adjusting policy to make sure it's affordable. But, it's cost me having a campaign that goes after me continually on net zero, and I'm very glad, therefore, that Labour agree with me that we should have affordable energy.
We will have gas, and just to be clear, we will have oil and gas for years. We won't have new licences under a Labour government. What we will have is thousands of new jobs created by green energy, which will be cheaper and more secure in the long run and better for the planet.
I'll come back to you two in just a moment. Rishi Sunak, Katie, says that this will be another example of the plan working. Is it?
I mean, I think bills coming down is clearly a good thing. You can't go against that. Our voters are going to have much time to feel it in terms of the election date. Not really, it's a couple of days. Clearly, if it was going the other way, that'd be a very negative story for the government. But I think it comes back to the question, which is, do people feel as though, their lives are improving in terms of their finances? Or does the government look as though it's patting itself on the back and saying, well done, and it's not actually cutting through yet? And I think you can see from America, where they've had a much better economic recovery from the UK, that Joe Biden, who is the leader, he's in the government, is not really getting the credit for that. Donald Trump is often in many polls the favourite. And it does, I think, just show that even if you have quite good economic news, it doesn't always feed through to voters saying thank you very much.
Rachel?
I would agree with that entirely. I think one of Rishi Sunak's problems is he sees the lines going in the right direction on the graph and assumes that will filter through into the way that people are actually feeling. Obviously, this is a good news story, but in the context of do people feel better off than they did at the beginning of this Parliament in 2019, clearly the answer is going to be no for a lot of households. The cost of living crisis is still really severe. Inflation coming down doesn't mean that prices are coming down. It just means that they're rising more slowly. And so for Sunak to claim that this is a win and part of the plan working, that's not going to chime with what a lot of people are feeling.
I mean, how big a problem is that, Steve? Not getting the credit for this, because people still feel worse off than they did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and particularly, I mean, Sarah is right in terms of, yes, bills have fallen, but they are still around 50% more expensive than they were before the price shock.
Well, of course, it's a problem when you don't get credit for good things that you've done. But I think that, it is worth remembering that the plan that we have is to deal with events. I mean, events, I'm afraid, do take us all by. You mentioned the war in Ukraine. That caused gas prices to surge. It fed through into fertiliser prices and therefore into food prices. COVID had a profound impact on our society. And these things, I'm afraid, have now needed dealing with. If you look at furlough, for example, that Rishi was right to lead with furlough. If he hadn't put furlough in, can you imagine the state we'd be in today? So it's an incredibly expensive scheme. But Rishi, precisely because he does sympathise with people, I've seen it myself. He's actually consulted me a couple of times about his fears about the least well-off. And I've got a great deal of faith that it's not merely about lines on the graph. He really understands what people are going through. Just very briefly, Sarah, Great British Energy, the company that Labour want to set up, can you sit here today and say we'll be paying less for our energy if you win the election?
Yes.
Categorically?
Yes, bills will go down in the next Parliament by about £300. Over the long term, we make no apologies for having a long-term plan on this because we need to transition. I mean, the amount of money we have just spent having to give people money to pay their energy bills, tens of billions of pounds. The Institute, the OBR, says if we don't do something serious in terms of policy on energy, we'll have another shock in 8-10 years, and it will just keep repeating. So Great British Energy, all our other plans are the way to make us more secure and bring those costs down over the long term. Well, let's talk to Paul Johnson, the Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Hello to you. While you're sitting there, Paul, I'm just going to show our guests and viewers a tweet you sent yesterday. It says, if Rachel Reeves, Shadow Chancellor, and Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, are going to meet their fiscal target they're both agreed on, to get debt falling, then they will have to choose between spending cuts and tax increases. They should tell us what they intend to do. Why did you say that?
Because I think it's a really important part, what ought to form the centrepiece of this campaign, and I rather fear that it won't. I mean, some context here is really important. First of all, we have tax rises and spending cuts planned in the plans that are set out by this government. That's what's due over the next few years. Neither party has said that they won't do those. So in that sense, both seem to be accepting the status quo, which is tax rises and spending cuts over the next few years. And part of the reason we're in this difficult position is we've got very, very high debt interest bill because interest rates are higher. We've got obviously a big pile of debt, and both parties are committed, and both Rachel Reeves and Jeremy Hunt have said this very, very explicitly. They're committed to getting debt down over the last year of the coming Parliament. Now, to get debt down over the last year of the coming Parliament will require not just those tax increases that we've got coming in and spending cuts that we've got coming in, but probably more than that. And what we're not hearing from either side is even what the spending cuts will be that are planned, or how they would pay for any additional spending, or if they're going to do tax cuts, what the additional spending cuts would be. Well, Paul, Keir Starmer was asked about what you've been saying just now and over the last 24 hours when he was on the BBC's Today programme this morning. And he said he disagreed with you that Labour could achieve their plans because they're relying on growth. Let's have a listen.
I mean, respectfully, I disagree with Paul Johnson on this. I do think that we can go for growth. I think if you've got a comprehensive plan for growth that's thought through and had the detailed discussions with partners for growth, we can do this. And I'm not a defeatist. I don't accept that we just have to accept that we can't get the growth. We had significant growth under the last Labour government.
Are you being a defeatist, Paul?
I hope not. I think I'm trying to be a realist. Now, it is true that we may get more growth over this period, but equally we may get less. And all of the numbers that I've just quoted are based on the OBR's, Office of Budget Responsibility's forecast for growth, which are actually pretty optimistic. They're much more optimistic than the Bank of England's forecasts, for example, and actually they're more optimistic than the average of independent forecasters. So even that rather, I'm sorry, gloomy picture I painted, it's actually based on some forecasts which are more optimistic than most. It's worth saying, I think, I'm sadly old enough to remember lots of elections where the parties have said, we'll pay for everything because we're the ones that have the key to growth. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. The second point to make is, yes, it is absolutely right. And I think, the Keir Starmer is absolutely right about this. There are a set of things that parties can do, that governments can do to get growth going. And some of the things that we've heard spoken about, planning reform is very definitely one of them,
yes,
which will help growth. The key point, though, is it helps growth into the medium term. It's not going to make an enormous amount of difference in the short run. So if you are focused on those fiscal targets, and I'm just taking those as given, those are things that the big parties have said that they want to do, then you are going to be constrained, at the very least for the first 3 or 4 years of a parliament, by the fact that that is where the fiscal numbers are at the moment. I'm not at all saying you shouldn't focus on that long-term growth. You absolutely should, but you're still going to have to take hard decisions in the short term.
Paul Johnson, thank you very much. Will it be tax rises or further spending cuts, Sarah, in order... Sorry, Paul, thank you. In order to meet the debt target and the fiscal rule that you've set?
Well, look, it's clear the Conservatives have left the country worse off than when they started, right? So we need to be honest. Paul is right about the challenges that we face.
Though, in terms of what you might have to do if you win the election?
Completely honest. Now, we're saying we're going to go for growth. I don't think that's a contentious argument. Everybody would say...
They're going for growth, so there's no difference. There's no difference.
No, there is. What is contentious is how you go for growth. Now, we believe in an industrial strategy in the same way that most countries that are growing around the world have already implemented and are increasingly implementing. If you look at the US, you look at China, obviously, you look at
Sarah,
the EU, you look at France.
You've also dropped your £28 billion promise to invest in green policies, or it's certainly going to be a lot less. So I just want to put growth there. Let's assume you do get growth. Let's assume you get quite good growth. But in the first few years, as we've heard from Paul Johnson, are you going to increase taxes or make further spending cuts to unprotected departments in order to keep your fiscal rule that Rachel Reeves is absolutely wedded to? Or are you going to drop the fiscal rule?
So we've been clear where tax is going to shift, whether it's VAT on private schools, whether it's private equity bonuses, whether it's cracking down on tax avoiders. We've been clear on that, and we've costed it, and it will make a real difference in terms of our education and our schools. We are saying, of course, that we want to bring taxes down. It's an unfair tax system at the moment. We have the highest burden we've had for a long time. But I disagree with the premise that growth will take too long. We have to do the long-term things. Everybody's fed up of the sticking plaster approach. But look, there are hundreds... Let me just make one point. There are hundreds of millions of pounds of ready-to-go projects waiting because they can't get permission or they can't get the they can't get on the grid. If we unlock that, we bring in growth just on that front, and there's a raft of other policies too.
I think the question is the pace of growth. Now, you look at all the forecasts, we are expecting growth, and Keir Starmer will probably be able to say if Labour wins the election, he has overseen growth. Will it be the fastest in the G7? We'll have to see. But I think privately, what a lot of us are expecting, and I think including some Labour MPs, is not to hear anything from Rachel Reeves about which she would go to because Paul Johnson might have a point, but instead a scenario where if Labour win the election, quite quickly in the first few days, we get some kind of speech from Keir Starmer or Rachel Reeves saying, you know what, guys, it's even worse than we thought. We've been inside these government buildings and we have to say we thought things were bad. They're even worse. Now the sums don't add up and now we might have to do some tax rises. And I think that is one area where I think, figures on both sides can imagine that scenario, and some in Labour even admit it's quite likely.
Right.
And in addition, both party spending plans at the moment are predicated on really deep departmental spending cuts in the next spending cycle. For unprotected departments, some departments are going to be facing efficiency savings of up to a fifth, and none of the civil servants in those departments think that that level of efficiency savings is possible, even imaginable. You've got independent experts calling these spending plans set out by the Conservatives but agreed to by Labour fictional or fantasy economics.
Yes.
And that's true for both of the main parties, and we haven't had a serious answer on what's going to happen to justice spending, on transport infrastructure,
prisons, or whatever.
Prisons, all of those areas.
And just very briefly, I'd add to that, if you think about the Labour Parliamentary Party, I mean, we're so used to saying, what does the Tory Parliamentary Party think? Because we've had a Tory government for so long. A Labour Parliamentary Party is going to be more geared towards tax rises, I think, than spending cuts.
Well,
I'd like to have more opposition, I think, among Labour MPs to spending cuts.
Right, well, we'll come back to the issue of tax rises again with you, Sarah, throughout the programme. But, Steve, on tax cuts, you're one of those Conservative MPs, of which there are many, who would like to have seen further tax cuts. Is that why we're having this election? Because there wasn't enough money to cut taxes further, so he decided to go for it, Rishi Sunak?
I couldn't comment on that. I mean, the Prime Minister doesn't share with me the reasons for doing those things, but that would be pure speculation on my part. We've covered such a wide range of things. It's almost difficult to know where to go. But what I would say is that whatever problems we have at the moment, they can't be because taxes are too low, because government spends too little, because we've borrowed too little money,
you've increased
or because
taxes
interest
so much,
rates have been too low with too little QE. The reality is that the consensus of a very long time has led us to where we are, and Rishi understands that we need to produce more and we need to spend less. And he really does understand economics. It's always actually a joy to see Keir Starmer lead in on economics, because Rishi really knows what he's doing.
Well, does he, in those terms? Because where are you going to get the money for the increase in defence spending, then? From cutting unprotected departments, I presume. If you say Rishi Sunak really understands that we need to spend less, he's committed to spending more on defence, 2.5% of our national income.
When it comes to defence, I think anyone looking at the world today knows we need to spend more on defence. The Ukraine crisis has really exposed a weakness, particularly in supply chains for weapons. These are the sorts of things which we're dealing with. And I think 2.5% on defence is very wise and necessary.
But where would you get the money from? We haven't really had the discussion about where, if the Conservatives win the election, you'll get that money from.
Well, this is why I think that Paul actually makes an extremely important contribution to public debate, as does the OBR. But if I may, just to try and zoom in on some of the points that have been made, the OBR says we'll meet our fiscal rules. And we have managed to cut taxes in relation to national insurance. We have managed to increase spending
but only
on the NHS.
The highest levels of taxation.
Well, indeed. So, I mean, I would be very happy to have an extended programme and rehearse some of the arguments I've made over 12 years about the trajectory of where we're going. I mean, if you look at the fiscal sustainability report over the next 20 years, you know, we could have a long conversation, but we are at some point going to have to get really honest with the public about what happens in 20 years' time unless we start producing more and spending less. And that's why I say that I really do have faith in Rishi, because I've had the conversation with him. He knows it's true, and he knows that we need more growth and growth in the free market, not in the state.
Is this a bit of good news? Darren McCaffrey, journalist at Sky, he says, best news of the day, an order to extend licensing hours during the Euros that will enable people to get properly on the lash, Lord Sharp's words, not mine, has passed through the House of Lords and is ready for royal assent. This obviously, I can see you smiling there, this obviously one of the pieces of sort of legislation going through at the moment. Something to welcome, Steve?
Yeah, of course it is. People love football and they love being in the pub to watch football, so of course it's good news, yeah.
Do you think they'll appreciate the general election happening while the Euros are on?
I suspect that for most people, as on any day of the year, will pay very little heed to politics, especially when the football is on, and I don't think it will much interrupt them. But generally speaking, I think people don't really want to be bothered by those of us who are in politics, but I'm sure they'll enjoy the football. Well,
I just want to play everyone this clip of you, actually, Steve Baker, talking to Victoria Derbyshire on Newsnight, because you've obviously thought about an alternative life if you don't remain an MP. Let's have a look.
What do you want to do if you're not an MP?
Skydiving, motorcycling, fast catamaran sailing. There are a wide range of things I'll do. I think you're talking about work, though.
I was talking about the work, but that's fine.
The first thing I'm going to do if I don't win my seat is have a long break.
Oh, Steve, you had all those great extreme sports, they sounded like, at the tip of your tongue there. Have you been thinking about it?
I forgot the skiing, but look, the reality is I was trying to make light of a very difficult question we're asked. We're asked time and again, but what will you do? As if we were all useless and weren't going to find work. And so it was a tongue-in-cheek response to a question that does slightly get on my nerves. But, you know, skydiving, skiing, fast cat sailing is what I like to do. And, you know, but this is not really the substance of the election campaign. But if you ask me what I'm going to be doing, I will have a break if I lose. Yeah.
Well, we now know what the former leader of the Labour Party is going to be doing in this election. I think we can show you the headline in the Islington Tribune. I'm talking about Jeremy Corbyn. He says, "Why I'm standing as an independent candidate at the general election," because he is no longer a Labour MP. He is still a member of the Labour Party. He was pushed out, or expelled, I should say, from the parliamentary party after he suggested that the scale of the party's handling when he was leader of anti-Semitism complaints had been dramatically overstated by opponents. It's not very helpful, is it, for Labour, Jeremy Corbyn standing?
I think he's part of the past, not part of Labour's future. And it is what it is. We'll have a brilliant candidate, I'm sure, in Islington. And, you know, I think we've all moved on, really, from Jeremy.
Right. I mean, I should say, sorry, he's no longer a member of the Labour Party because, of course, he's now standing as an independent. How difficult will that be?
See, I lived in Islington North for 9 years. I only moved out of the constituency at the end of last year, and I have always found the argument that Jeremy Corbyn is such a prominent local figure that he would be able to mount a strong independent campaign. That has never really chimed with my experience living in the constituency. He certainly wasn't particularly active in the time that I was there, and I had contacted him for constituency matters, personal matters, and not really got very much response from his office.
Because, I mean, he has been the Labour MP there since 1983.
He's been there for a very long time, but Labour support in that seat is very strong. And I think if you look at independent candidates throughout history, when MPs leave their parties for whatever reason and choose to stand independently, they often find that a lot of the support they got was more party-based than it was personal-based. But I don't think this is going to come as a surprise to anyone in Labour. I think Labour have been very aware that this was a very high possibility, if not a certainty, since he was expelled from the parliamentary party.
Is it a headache for the Labour Party, Katie? I mean, Keir Starmer, of course, served under Jeremy Corbyn. Less than 5 years ago, Keir Starmer campaigned to make him Prime Minister.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of a headache. Of course, I think both Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak have their problems in terms of former leaders. Labour will talk about Liz Truss, the Tories will talk about Jeremy Corbyn. Keir Starmer can say Jeremy Corbyn is no longer in the party, but he did campaign for him twice. So I think we're going to have probably a lot of those two former leaders are probably going to get a lot of airtime in these debates, I imagine, these head-to-heads, because both sides think they can score blows over it. And having Jeremy Corbyn run as an independent, I'm not sure how that plays into it, because it is a reminder he's not in the Labour Party anymore.
Sarah?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, and I think it was interesting. I did see his tweet. He put out a little video explaining what he's doing, and he was saying that whoever's the Prime Minister, he's going to be there to hold them to account, because that's what MPs do. And I think there's a fundamental difference of view there between him and Keir Starmer. We're there to try and get into power, to actually get things done, rather than just sort of campaign against all the time. And I think Jeremy, Keir Starmer will make a brilliant Prime Minister in a way that clearly the people decided Jeremy Corbyn would not, and we should all move on from that now.
Although, of course, he did serve under Jeremy Corbyn. Quite a few Labour MPs left the party over the issue of anti-Semitism. Why didn't he?
Well, I think we had the conversations from within. This has all been well rehearsed over many years. What Keir Starmer has been completely clear about as leader is that anti-Semitism was the thing that we had to root out of the party as the first point, and I think shows in the way that he's changed the Labour Party how he can change the country as well.
Well, what's happened to the broad church in the Conservative Party? I'm just going to show you this tweet from Christopher Hope at GB News. Boris Johnson ally David Frost has been banned from standing as Tory candidate in the general election, I understand. Lord Frost was yesterday told that he couldn't apply for any of the 93 vacant seats where the party is yet to nominate a candidate for the election. Frost, low-tax Tory, one of the architects of former Prime Minister Boris Johnson's Brexit deal. What's your reaction? Should he be allowed to stand?
Well, he's a member of the House of Lords,
of
course, and David has enormous respect from me and admiration for the Trade and Cooperation Agreement that he agreed with the EU under immense stress and pressure, and I think he played an absolutely historic
So should he
role.
be allowed to stand?
Well, I think the problem that the party has, much as I think overwhelmingly agree with him, but the problem is, of course, if you make yourself a columnist and criticise the government, they're bound to be a bit reluctant to make you an MP. But, you know, I think David's got a huge role to play in the future of our country. In the House of Lords, you can do just, you can even be, it turns out, the Foreign Secretary. So, you know, I think for David, if he's in the House of Lords, I very much hope that he'll be in a future Conservative government. You know?
Katie?
Well, he initially, I think, you know, this time last year, when they were sorting out candidate selection, had the different tiers of passes you can get when you try and be a Tory candidate. And he had, well, obviously I'm being a bit flashy here, but almost a VIP all-access pass, which meant you could go for any seat in theory, but obviously it's never quite as simple as that. And even then, there were lots of MPs, when I wrote that, saying, why on earth is he technically allowed to go for so many seats because he's so critical of us? Now, I don't know the exact details of this case, but I think a lot of this, if we go back to the beginning of the year, when there was that mysterious poll in the Telegraph, MRP suggesting, we didn't know quite who it was funded by, it was a group that we couldn't find much about, but David Frost was linked to it through his work at the Telegraph. And I think that's where there's been a lot of bad blood between David Frost and Rishi Sunak's team, and a question of there's one thing being critical, there's another thing when you start to be accused of trying to bring down the Prime Minister. Now, David Frost would, of course, deny that, but I think that is partly where you get to. But candidate selection next week for the Tory party is going to be fascinating because they've got these seats. I think about a dozen of the 90-something are probably seen as winnable, which tells you something about where the Tory party is. But there is going to be quite a bun fight amongst ambitious special advisors and so forth to get those seats.
All political parties want discipline. They want MPs who will follow the lead that they're given. And, you know, I probably am an exemplar of what happens if you allow someone in who's got a very strong view on a set of subjects. But, you know, I think it's reasonable for a party leader to insist on discipline. I'm certainly trying to do my bit to be disciplined.
You wouldn't have said that a few years ago, would you, Steve?
Well, I certainly would be willing to give a long interview on it. I'm sure I have at different stages.
Well, I'll keep that in my mind, depending on what happens at the election. Now, it is the last day for Parliament to push through legislation. We talked about it yesterday. It's a process called wash-up. And there are various bills that either go through or they fall, winners and losers. And we'll get into those in just a moment. But let's catch up with the campaign, the Rishi Sunak campaign, because my colleague, political correspondent Nick Eardley, has been travelling with him.
Just on our way to the airport in Belfast just now after Rishi Sunak's tour of the UK. He's been to all 4 nations in the past 24 hours. In some ways, being here in Northern Ireland is a bit strange. The Conservatives only stand nominal candidates here. They only got 5,000 votes in the whole of Northern Ireland at the last general election. But it allows Rishi Sunak to talk about things like the Windsor Agreement and getting power sharing back up and running at Stormont. Some things that he would argue are big achievements. The other thing that he wants to talk about today is TV debates. The Conservatives are trying to make this a big thing, saying that they want to have weekly debates over the course of the campaign, something Labour don't want to do. They only want a couple on some of the bigger broadcasters as things stand. Rishi Sunak has done a poll clip this morning, and one of the interesting things that he's being asked about a lot now is some of the big bold promises he's made over the past few months as Prime Minister, to ban smoking for people born after 2009. It's not going to happen now because they've run out of time. Renters reform, not going to happen now because they've run out of time in Parliament. And it is raising a few eyebrows, a few people questioning, why has he gone so early? It means he can't go to the electorate and say, here are the big things I promised, I've got them done. Now, he does say he's still committed to the smoking ban and he will still try and get that through if he's Prime Minister after the election. But it means one part of Rishi Sunak's legacy, or what could have been his legacy, now is up in the air.
That was Nick Eardley. Just before we go on, Craig McKinley, the Conservative MP, who you may remember re-entered or came into the Palace of Westminster, into Parliament, after surviving sepsis. He lost both his hands and his feet. Here he is. He was being applauded by other MPs. I mean, it is quite an incredible story. Anyway, he's decided not to stand at the next election. And as to the tally, yes, you're disappointed,
I'm
Steve.
very upset about that, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
He's a hero. He's been through absolute hell. I only went to see him once in hospital, but to see him in the condition he was in was extremely difficult, and it could happen to any of us. And he's absolutely right to highlight the dangers of sepsis. We should all be very alive to it. But no, I don't mind openly admitting I'm very moved that he made his way back into Parliament, and I was glad to be there to hear what he said. But he's been through hell, a kind of unimaginable hell that I hope none of us ever see. But unfortunately, it's an all too real a risk, and I really pay tribute to Craig for the way he's come through this and for the personal resolve and resilience he's shown. I mean, he's genuinely a hero to me.
Sarah, were you there on Wednesday when he came back to Parliament?
I wasn't in the chamber, but I saw him in afterwards, kind of walking around and greeting people, and everybody was sort of... Well, everybody, I think, was incredibly moved by just what he's been through and the strength of his resolve to come back. So that's sad news.
I mean, he has published this statement, personal remarks. The snap election announcement has caused me 36 hours of intense soul-searching. Whilst my heart tells me to stand again, there being so much unfinished business across local regeneration and national issues which are important to me, my head knows this to be impossible at this time. You can sort of understand it, can't you?
Of course you can. Craig's whole political career is a remarkable story that deserves to be properly told. But of course you can understand. I mean, I think after what he's been through, it's an amazing achievement that he came back to the House of Commons with those prosthetics and stood there on those prosthetics and said what he said. I mean, he should have all of our admiration. We're all only human. And, yeah, it's a terrific thing he's done.
I mean, there are so many MPs, as is often the case at a general election. I don't think it's record numbers across the House who are standing down, aren't they?
Yeah, we're getting close, but we're not yet at the figure of Tory MPs that stood down ahead of the 1997 election. But I think if you add, obviously, Craig McKinley choosing to, and we've still got a weekend to go, we could still get there. And it definitely feels like there's a particularly large Tory exodus. Also Labour MPs standing down. But I think it's a mix of, some thinking they're not going to hold their seat, and others actually thinking they'd rather pursue other career options.
I think what's interesting is you're getting a high number specifically of the 2019 new intake that would have been the new generation, and all those MPs often quite young, quite vibrant, full of energy in 2019, who were being talked about as staying for decades. They've had a taste of it. They've had 5 years and they're deciding not to go for it. Now, whether that's because they obviously had quite a turbulent time with the COVID pandemic and Parliament by Zoom and all of that wasn't quite what they thought, or whether it's that they don't really feel like stomaching a term or two in opposition, it's not clear. But I think the fact that you're getting so many young MPs standing down is quite significant.
Let's go back to what we call wash-up, because there are bills and important pieces of legislation that are not going to make it through. I should say that the former sub-postmasters caught up in the Post Office Horizon scandal will have their convictions overturned today when the bill to enable it officially becomes law. But this tweet from Diana Johnson, Labour MP. Figan Murray, the mother of Martin Hett, murdered in the Manchester Arena terror attack, walked 200 miles to meet with the Prime Minister on the 7th anniversary of the terror atrocity. The Prime Minister promised Figan he would introduce Martin's law before the summer recess. I mean, there are so many important pieces of legislation that aren't going to make it.
I checked on that point before I came on. If we win power, a Conservative government will introduce Martin's law before recess, yes.
Right, but in terms of these things being on the sort of statute beforehand...
So I think it's inevitable, now we've got rid of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, for what good it was, that some part of any government's agenda will fall down because a snap election can be called. And I think unless the Prime Minister's willing to fix a date far in advance, there's always going to be some legislation for any government of any party that will fall when we go for an election.
Would that commitment to her hours before deciding to call an or he would have already decided, he would have known he intended to call an election when he made that grieving mother that promise?
Polling day's the 4th of July. If we win, he will introduce that legislation to keep that promise.
Will Labour introduce it?
Well, I agree. It seems like a betrayal of a promise, but of course Labour will introduce it. We're trying to work with the government to get through the pieces of legislation that that can be got through. So on the infected blood scandal, on the Post Office, hopefully these things will be sorted. But obviously, Rishi Sunak's legacy on the smoking bill is lost, and the renters bill is lost. I mean, that was watered down a lot anyway, but there was some improvements there for private renters. And, you know, we're going to have a job to do when we get back in to go, well, what are the things that we agreed with here? What were the things that you know, reflect our values, and what can we then do about it?
Well, I mean, his big pledge, Rishi Sunak, to end smoking for the next generation. That was supposed to be his sort of legacy, if you like. That's not going to get on the statute either. I mean, Rishi Sunak is going into this election, Steve. No flights going to Rwanda, renters reform not happening, no fault evictions. That was a manifesto pledge in 2019. And now the smoking ban. I mean, what are you campaigning on here?
Well, we're going to campaign on a wide range of pledges.
But on those,
what we're campaigning on, but not those things.
Well, no, but what are you campaigning on if these were the big promises from a Prime Minister? There is a sort of issue of trust.
I think he's very, very clear that there are going to be flights to Rwanda if we come back. If Labour win power, Labour will cancel the flights, and we'll end up with at a time when Europe is moving.
And we'll tackle the problem with proper policy.
Yeah, but the point is, you've gone into a campaign without a flight being taken off. He's confirmed that.
I'm sorry. When we look at what Labour have said, the only thing that Labour want to do, that you can identify as being material, we're already doing. There's already an appropriate task force set up, working across multiple.
No, there isn't.
Well, I'm not
Not
going to sit
in the
going
way with
years.
the
And on the smoking,
But
ban. I mean, that was a very personal investment for the Prime Minister.
And he is committed to it.
Right. Would you introduce it? More Labour MPs supported it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a policy we supported, so whether we bring it in exactly the same wording, all of those issues need to be resolved. But yeah, the intent is there, of course.
Right. Let's have a look at this headline on TV debates, or debates in general. The Daily Telegraph. Starmer doesn't have the courage to debate me, says Sunak. The Prime Minister hopes to expose the Labour leader on the economy by challenging him to a record 6 televised debates. Is that what it is? He's too scared?
Well, he debates the Prime Minister every week, and the Prime Minister never answers a question. So there is going to be, you know, we absolutely will do those head-to-head debates in the way that we have always done in the past. But, you know, we're very committed to going out and talking to people across the country, which is what Keir will be doing, rather than being holed up in TV studios, not talking to the public.
I mean, it was a ridiculous idea, wasn't it, to do 6 televised debates? That would be 1 a week.
I don't think it's ridiculous, no. I mean, if you look at the way our system works, and I've been a minister not once but twice, you can see that so much goes on because a Prime Minister's decided. I think that doing 6 debates will clearly expose who grasps the detail, who knows what they're doing, who's got the resolve and the clear plan to get our country where it needs to be going. So, yeah, I'm all in favour.
Right, well, I mean, there are going to be 2 head-to-head debates. I mean, is it because Rishi Sunak's the underdog here? He's got nothing to lose, so why not go for 6?
I'm quite surprised that Rishi Sunak wants to go for as many as he does, given that in 2022 we had a Conservative leadership campaign that had many head-to-head debates. Rishi Sunak didn't come across all that well in a number of them, and indeed he lost that leadership contest to Liz Truss, who is herself not a stellar debater. Now, I can understand Labour being cautious on the number of opportunities that they offer, given that they're ahead, but I think this idea that Rishi Sunak is this incredible, charismatic debater that will be able to change the public's minds in these debates. We haven't seen that.
I think this is the classic, though, isn't it? This is ultimately the classic dynamic in any election. Yeah. We can change the parties depending on the poll leads. I'm sure if Keir Starmer was 20 to 25 points behind, he would be the one challenging for 6 debates. It comes to a point where you're thinking, how can you shift things? And you're just going to throw many things at the wall. He's got a lot less to lose on that. Of course, I think the Tory leadership contest example is valid in many ways, but it was also a very different audience. And I think that if you looked at some of the polling during that Tory leadership contest, Rishi Sunak would often poll better with the public than Liz Truss would, but you were talking to Tory members. And the polls were a bit closer by the time you got to the end of it. So I think they want to add to the sense, because if you're trying to say Keir Starmer is shifty and won't say his plans, him not doing debates probably helps you land that message.
But there will be 2 head-to-head debates. Let me just clarify that, because Keir Starmer has agreed to do 2
Well,
debates.
that's super. I wish you'd agreed to do 6, because I noticed that Sarah nodded along to what Rachel was saying. And if you all agreed on the left that actually Rishi, if you think that Rishi's not a good debater, then it's in your interest to say yes to 6 debates. Bring on 6 debates.
It's in the interest of the British people that we go out there and have a conversation with them
not expose your leader.
And meet as many of them as possible, and we will do the debates in exactly the same way as normal. And, you know, I agree with the premise that the more we see of Rishi Sunak, the less the public public like him, so I am surprised he wants to do this. But you know, we will have our election plans, we will have our election conversations with the public, we will do the debates as we should, and that's the end of it. And let's not deflect from the fact that we've had 14 years of a Conservative government. It's time for change, and that's what Rishi Sunak is trying to deflect from all the time.
Well, we're going to see and hear a bit more from the Liberal Democrats, as is usual during an election campaign. Let's talk to Sarah Olney, Liberal Democrat MP. Sarah, welcome to you. Now the campaign is underway. Yesterday, sort of day one, we asked the Labour and Conservative politicians to give a 30-second pitch for the election. Why don't you give us yours for the Liberal Democrats?
Excellent. I'd be very happy to. I think what we're finding as we've been going out talking to voters, people are sick to death of this Conservative government. They want to get rid of them. And there are certain seats up and down the country where the way to get rid of a Tory MP is to vote Liberal Democrat. And we are going out in those seats across the blue wall, and we are talking to voters about the things that really concern them. And it's about the NHS. It's about getting a GP appointment. It's about sewage in their local rivers. It's about the cost of living. It's about crime and antisocial behaviour. And we'll be going out across the country during this general election, and we'll be talking to the voters, and we'll have you know, real solutions to those problems. We've had Ed Davey down in Eastbourne today. Oh, sorry.
Your 30 seconds are up. I think you've gone over.
Sorry.
I might don't apologise. I'm not going to watch anyway, so I'm not clocking it in that sense. But it sounds about 30 seconds. People may remember the Liberal Democrats for being in coalition, of course, with the Conservatives from 2010 to 2015. You say you're contesting in many of those seats the Conservatives. Are you no longer a party that leans towards the Tories, then?
Well, in this general election, we'll be out fighting those seats that we think we can win. We'll be talking to the voters about the things that matter to them. But what is coming across very loud and clear is that people are sick to death of this Conservative government. Its time is up. It's out of ideas, and people want something different. And and the Liberal Democrats are talking to them about the things that matter to them. It's about GPs. It's about sewage in the rivers. It's about the cost of living.
OK, well, let's have a look at some campaigning pictures of Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, who's been in Eastbourne. I mean, if you're taking on the Conservatives, does that mean that you're leaning closer in terms of your values and outlook to the Labour Party?
I mean, we will always be reflecting our own values and our own policies and the things that we care about. Ed in Eastbourne today is talking about recruiting 8,000 new GPs, making available 650 million more GP appointments before the end of the Parliament, because those are the things that we really care about, and we know that our voters really care about. So those are the sorts of issues that we'll be fighting this general election on.
Right, but if the outcome of the election is Labour, let's say, as the largest party, doesn't have a majority, would the Liberal Democrats enter a confidence and supply agreement with Labour?
Our priority at this time is just to get out there, speak to as many voters as we can, and get as many Liberal Democrat MPs in the next Parliament as we possibly can. Everything else can wait till after the election. We know what we're setting out to do.
Right, you haven't talked about or had any conversations about what might happen after polling day?
The conversations we're having right now with voters up and down the country, and particularly across the blue wall, about the kind of change that they want to see.
Right. Well, of course, that's what all the politicians will be doing. When it comes to the European Union, what are your stages to rejoining the European Union? You have a route map.
Well, look, I mean, the Tories have just completely destroyed our relationship with Europe, and we see all around us all the time the difficulties that's creating, particularly for our businesses, the trade barriers that have been put up, the friction, the additional costs that is creating for British consumers. So we are very committed to trying to address some of those problems that the Conservatives' botched Brexit deal has created, particularly for our business community. And we're not under any illusions. It's going to take time. We've got to start with rebuilding that relationship. We need to rebuild trust. We can start with side agreements, things like, for example, a youth mobility scheme.
All right.
But, you know, we want to keep building that relationship with Europe.
Sarah Olney, thank you very much. You too want to embrace Europe, or hold them a little closer than perhaps the UK has up until now. That's true.
We want to make Brexit work. We have our red lines, which are really clear in terms of not re-entering, you know, the customs union or the single market. But there are, you know, I'm shadow industry minister. I talk to industry all the time. There are all kinds of barriers to trade that they talk to us about.
So was there anything you disagreed with that Sarah Olney said in terms of the route map?
Well, I mean, no, yes. I mean, we've been really clear. We need to make it work. So we need that veterinary agreement for sure. You know, the original trade deal, the EU agreement that Boris Johnson negotiated was bad. That's why we've had the Windsor Agreement since, and that's why we've had the Erasmus scheme since. It's kind of unravelling as we go. There are some clear things we need to do to make sure our businesses can trade and that we are secure in the future.
I personally have been intimately involved in rehabilitating the relationship with Ireland and the EU, and anyone can see it by checking the press. The relationship's going great guns. We can certainly have a bright future working with them as equal partners.
That's all we have time for. Bye-bye.